Okay, we have an update for you on the bipartisan infrastructure negotiations that have been ongoing. I mean, the bottom line here is this whole attempt at a bipartisan package is pretty much a hot mess. One good thing did happen. Biden came out. Remember, one of the pay-fors that they've been floating with this is a gas tax, which is absurd that you're going to make the working class of this country long-suffering and with like the least ability to pay, that you're going to put the infrastructure price tag on their back. So Biden did come out and rule that out, and they're framing it. And I mean, he has, on these sorts of things, he has pretty good political instincts, I think. And he also sees it as would be breaking his pledge not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year, which I think is true. We can throw this tweet up on the screen showing what Biden had to say there. So this was Jen Psaki to CBS this morning, said Biden is a hard no on the gas tax, an idea that's been floating around that certainly the president would not support is a gas tax, which would raise taxes on people making less than $400K a year. We're not going to stand for that. So very clear language, very unequivocal. At least someone has half a brain over there, because a gas tax is like the dumbest idea that has ever. It's politically dumb, and it's also the wrong thing to
immoral.
do. Just like on every level, it would be a bad direction to go in. Okay, so that's off the table. So what are the other pay-fors that are being proposed in this bipartisan infrastructure deal? Well, David Dayen, who always follow what this guy is doing. He's one of the few that really digs into the details and gets down to the nitty-gritty of what's actually being proposed. And it turns out, remember when Trump was proposing his infrastructure deal time and time again, and a lot of liberals and a lot of progressives were rightfully very exercised that this was like basically, it was a privatization of infrastructure, giveaway to the private sector, and the pay-fors there were very unconscionable. Well, a lot of those same mechanisms are being included in this bipartisan deal. So let's throw David Dayen's tear sheet up here on the screen. He says, bipartisan Senate infrastructure plan is a stalking horse for privatization. The scheme would fund new infrastructure by selling off old infrastructure. And by the way, Trump proposed the same thing. So here's some of the details. Let me just read you a little bit from the piece. He says, the really scary piece in terms of the pay-fors is labeled public-private partnerships, private activity bonds, and asset recycling, okay? In the name of building world-class infrastructure, these lawmakers will sell it off in fire sales to private financiers. We have lots of experience with infrastructure privatization that strongly suggest it should be avoided. Those first two things, public-private partnerships, you can imagine what that is. That's basically like toll roads, that sort of thing, where you're like, hey, private company, why don't you build our infrastructure? And then you can charge user fees, again, largely to working class people, to pay for it. You have private activity bonds. That's just like debt by another name. And asset recycling, which is one of these terms that you'd read and you're like, oh, recycling. That sounds good, right? Like that sounds creative.
Sounds great.
What's going on there?
Love it.
What they mean is we're going to take our existing port or whatever, sell it off, and then use that money to build some other thing. This has been tried here. It was tried, he points out, it was tried notably in Australia. Total failure, total disaster. Oftentimes the projects that they sell off were actually good public works projects that the public was benefiting from, the government was receiving tax revenue from, like a port is a good example of that. And then the things that they build, the like asset that they're, I guess, recycling this into, turn out to be sort of like harebrained and useless and not particularly well done. The other bottom line piece here is, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. There's always this assumption that's like baked into the American economic political ethos that, oh, the private sector must be more efficient. They must do a better job. They must do it in lower costs and all of that in a shorter time frame. But it's really not the case because, I mean, for a very obvious reason, the private sector has to build in profit margins into whatever it is they're doing. So we've seen time after time that you should not assume that relying more on the private sector is going to get you into a better place. But it's interesting because a lot of the criticism of the infrastructure package, the bipartisan infrastructure package thus far, has been around it's not enough money, something we've talked about here. Also from the left, like this isn't dealing with climate change whatsoever, both totally, in my view, legitimate criticisms. But this piece has been ignored until David Dayen pointed it out, and it's also really super important.
It's super important, and also it just shows how many Democrats are full of it. I mean, I love this line. There was a time when Democrats opposed such schemes. It was during the Trump administration. And
2
he
years
talks
ago. Yeah.
exactly about how Democrats rightfully and loudly objected to giving up public assets to private investors
Yeah.
because the biggest money makers would be favored. So why would he? I love this. Why would Democrats entertain going down the exact same road under Biden despite the fact that they rebuffed it under Trump? And I think that we all know what the answer to this is. And it actually is a decent example of like uniparty whenever it comes to the economic proposals that we put forward. And I agree, this is a terrible, absolutely terrible idea. And the Australia part, I actually didn't know. I looked a little bit into it, and he's totally right, which is that we borrowed this from a previous scheme. And in that case of what happened in Australia, there was actually a lot of outrage over some of the things that were auctioned off that were actually quite not profitable, but net positive or whatever in terms of tax revenue. And I've said this a million times. Instead of faking all these pay-fors, if there is one thing on earth that you deficit spend, it's called infrastructure. Because we all know that the social and economic benefits explode whenever you have infrastructure. It can open up new areas of commerce, it can open up new business lines, it can open up all sorts of different things, and that you will more than recoup it in terms of tax revenue, benefit to the community, and more. Infrastructure is by definition the type of thing that you're supposed to deficit spend for. And instead, we're playing all these like kabuki theater games in DC around auctioning things off that we already have, around raising, the private bonds or whatever. We're reading this like, why is any of this necessary? Go out and ask people, do you care about how the infrastructure package is paid for? In the most intuitive thing, even people who have businesses and more understand that the type of things that you deficit spend for are investments which are going to pay out 10x longer in the long run. So you put the money down. Well, when you're a government, this is one of the few times that the business, whatever example, actually does apply, you should do the exact same thing. And so I think the politics around this are just so farcical generally, and that the David Dayen piece reveals how, in a way, people use deficit politics and pay-fors in order to just cover up for a lot of corporate giveaways.
Yeah,
that's what so much of it seems to be.
It's an ideological agenda.
Yeah.
That's right. And actually, I think if you ask people, and we've seen some of the polling on this, how they want it to be paid for, they do have a preference. They want rich people and corporations
the Koch
to be
brothers
taxed.
thing. Yeah.
That's what they want. I mean, we saw in some of the polling that just the infrastructure package on its own, like, oh, we're going to invest in roads and bridges, et cetera, pretty popular. You add to that like, oh, and we're going to pay for it by taxing rich people. And they're like, oh, hell yeah, I'm in. The polling numbers actually jump up. So it says everything. Just I think that's really important to keep in mind as you're watching these negotiations play out. Because oftentimes the way that they're portrayed in mainstream media is like, oh, the bipartisan deal, they have to make these trade-offs to make it politically palatable for frontline Democrats in the midterms, et cetera, et cetera. No, you're actually proposing a plan that is less popular because you're trying to pair it initially with a gas tax, which is ridiculous. But now with these various privatization schemes, which are also unpopular, versus what is a clearly extremely popular position of paying for it with increased taxes on people who got tremendously wealthy during the pandemic, whether it's wealthy individuals or corporations. That is what the American people actually want. And so the fact that the political class is so nervous and unsure and basically putting off the table any of that tells you something. This isn't about them wanting the good politics of it. It's about them protecting their donors and protecting their friends in their social circle. And that's exactly how you end up with these harebrained schemes of like, let's sell off a port in order to build a new bridge.
Watching this thing become Obamacare 2.0 has been really sad to show that Biden and them actually just learned nothing. Obamacare ended up becoming a corporate nightmare mess. It became the political albatross that hung around his neck. Now it's June 22nd. Remember that they've already said they cannot hit the September deadline. Okay, I think the exact same thing's going to happen. The Republicans are going to filibuster. It's going to go all the way up until like Thanksgiving or Christmas Day or whatever. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a BS bill, which actually doesn't even do very much. It would be probably like $1 trillion or whatever in new spending. It won't be forcefully felt in many different communities. And there'll be some like windmill package, which will become the bane of, every single Democrat running in the midterms because of a bunch of attack ads. And what do we get from all of this? I think maybe a modest tax increase on people who are wealthy? Maybe. Even then, I don't actually think that's going to pass at all. So yeah, actually the only thing that might pass is some sort of fake gas tax. So he may have ruled it out now, but I won't hold my breath understanding how these things are moving through Congress. It's a huge political failure for the Biden administration, in my opinion.
Yeah, and again, a totally unnecessary one, totally unnecessary. And I just think, I'll say it again, I think it says everything about the sort of failed state nature of this country, that just the least controversial thing you could possibly do, like fixing a damn bridge, you can't even get your act together to do that. The basics of providing not just an investment for, jobs and business community, et cetera, but part of why these privatization schemes are such a problem is there's a lot of basic infrastructure that provides for safe quality of life, water systems, wastewater treatment plants, as I covered yesterday in large parts of West Virginia, other rural communities across the country. They don't even have clean drinking water. Like, that's never going to turn a profit for a company.
Of course not.
So we can't be in the business of only doing projects that you're going to be able to charge enough toll fees to turn a profit on, or charge enough user fees to turn a profit on. You're not going to make money building a wastewater treatment plant or a new water system in McDowell County, West Virginia. So and that's basically what's happened, is anything that hasn't been profitable for the private sector hasn't gotten done. And so you've got parts of the country that are reverting back to pre-New Deal era conditions, reverting back to developing world conditions, because we don't put any sort of a priority on people having the basic standards for the basic level quality of living. Everything is about profit, profit, profit. And apparently that ethos has thoroughly pervaded this new bipartisan infrastructure efforts. Really sad to see.
Very sad story.